Hey everybody, welcome back to Eggs. This week's special guest is Carman Pirie. Carman is the co-founder of Kula Partners, an agency that helps leading B2B manufacturers craft digital experiences that transform how they engage buyers, serve customers, and outpace their competition online. Carman is also the host of the Kula Ring Manufacturing Marketer podcast, here to talk about positioning and differentiation, the changing landscape of B2B buying, and so much more. Join me in welcoming our guest, Carman Pirie. How are you, Carman?
I'm doing fantastic, Ryan. Thank you for that kind introduction as well.
Yes, of course. Thank you so much for doing the show. This is a crazy time in the world right now, and we're really grateful for people willing to take their time and do the shows.
Yeah, I think it is a crazy time, but it's also, it's kind of nice to have a bit of normalcy along. I think most people in this kind of crazy time don't mind doing a little bit of work and
exactly. I totally
right.
agree. And I think it is important too that we do this kind of thing, and do try and maintain some semblance of normalcy, understanding the world is changing and evolving for a myriad of reasons right now. But I think it's great, the more we can kind of hang on to things that work. So, as we were saying, very grateful for your time.
So, but before we get into the actual deep conversation about business and all that stuff, we were talking a little bit beforehand about where you're located. You're up in Halifax. And I just have one question before we go on. Are they ever going to find the treasure? Oak Island.
I know. It's amazing to me. Okay, so yes, I'm fortunate enough to live in Nova Scotia, Canada. It's if it's not the most beautiful place in Canada, it's darn close. So, but it's funny to me how many times, because we work primarily with clients that are based in the U.S. And I could talk to people in Canada all day long, and they're never going to mention Oak Island to me. But it is a popular thing south of the border. So clearly the TV show has made an impact on you folks.
Yeah, my dad and I watch it religiously when it's on because it's just so intriguing, all the backstories and possibilities and this and that. But they seem to be milking it for everything they've got because it will never end.
Yeah, I attended this weird little conference once at the hotel that's kind of on the site of Oak Island, and otherwise, I'll admit, like I live about 40 minutes from there. And the most we ever think about it is kind of glancing at the sign as we drive by down the South Shore to go to some other place we actually want to show up to. So, and I don't know if I kind of got to wonder. I'm not originally from Nova Scotia, so I can kind of poke fun at them too at the same time. And it's like, I think you guys all just made this up.
Well, I was going to say, I'm not picking up on the aboots or the A's or any of these fun things that we, down here in America expect from our Canadians. But,
I'm not going to promise that it won't happen. And I do say a bit. I've never quite understood the aboot about. Like, I don't know if I hear that as I speak, but then I suppose that's just the point. You're not supposed to hear it. But niche and niche is where we can disagree adamantly, because I can't bring myself to say niche unless I'm just making fun.
It's such a funny word because I've started leaning into niche in recent times because so many people who I regard as more intelligent than me are saying it that way. So I've started doing it, but my whole life it was niche, my whole life. Yeah. And then just recently in the last 6 months, now I'm a niche man.
There you go. Well, look, that's kind of similar logic that I used once. We had recorded, this is way before we focused on manufacturing as an agency. And we were recording these videos for staff training for a set of long-term care facilities, senior homes. And part of it was around harassment training, which the proper way to pronounce harassment by Canadian Queen's English is harassment. Nobody pronounces it that way, really. And especially the folks that all worked at the old folks home, a seniors home. I guess you're not supposed to call them old folks home these days. This is what I grew up with. Everybody that worked there, I mean, we were quite heavily influenced by American media anyway when you live in Canada. And they did, even the term harassment they hadn't even heard of before. So we had to go through and re-record it. But in a last-ditch effort to try to not have to go through that expense, I said, but, isn't it nice when you can say harassment and you just feel smarter than everybody else? It didn't work.
Oh.
Well, Carman, how about we get this ball rolling? Can you give us a little background on yourself and your company and how it got founded and started?
Sure. Look, I've been at the marketing game for an awful long while. I guess I kind of cut my teeth more in sales and in politics a bit. That's a weird backstory. And then kind of got into the marketing game 20, 30 years ago or something now. It's not quite 30. I'm not dating myself that bad. But I guess, like a lot of people, work for some other agencies or what have you, but then the time comes when you strike out on your own. So we started Kula Partners a little over 10 years ago now. Originally, the firm started as a web design and development firm that would be pretty broadly focused, I guess, beyond that. And we evolved to be Canada's first HubSpot Platinum partner, and really we're early on the inbound bandwagon, as it were, and have evolved over the years to focus primarily on serving manufacturers in a B2B context, those that work within complex sales environments, usually with larger lifetime value of customer scenarios.
Okay. I saw something on your website about the name of Kula and something about a Kula Ring. Can you break that down for us?
Yeah. So the Kula trading ring is it's a fairly long-lived trading ring in Papua New Guinea. It's been going on for hundreds of years now, where pieces of Kula are traded between different tribes on the islands. And a piece of Kula is essentially a bracelet or a necklace, most often made out of seashells. And I think I may have this a little bit wrong, but one of them kind of circulates in a clockwise direction around the island, and the other one is a counterclockwise around the network of islands in some way. But the notion of these is that the only real purpose of the Kula is to be exchanged in these elaborate tribal trading ceremonies, where the purpose of giving the Kula is that the status of the person receiving it is elevated, and the piece of Kula is always being given by somebody with a higher status. And the whole enterprise is really around building social capital and cohesion. But nobody really owns the Kula. When you receive it, the only reason you receive it is so that you can then give it on to somebody else. So you don't own it. And when we started the agency, we saw a lot of what was happening in the world of social media at the time, and I mean, those are very early days, where there were a lot of things being shared that at the end of the day, nobody really owned, but they served to connect us to each other. So that's where Kula Partners came from, and our notion, if you dig deeper in our site, we've had a cube grenade from the time that we launched the business that Hugh McLeod did for gapingvoid.com. As people matter, objects don't. The notion that what we create as marketers really ought to be about bringing people together, not about the thing that we create itself.
Yeah, no, I think that's really great. It's funny that you mentioned that. That was actually my next note. Was about people matter and objects don't. I think, especially on its face, I mean, it's especially apropos of the times, but I think that it's also very forward thinking and also really critical aspect of business that maybe not everybody explores. I think especially you mentioned that you come from a sales background. And I think that, there's still, I mean, we're getting better, thank goodness, but I think there's still a little bit of a wrap around salesmen that they're busy pushing a product and they don't really care that much about the individual. And maybe this is where your marketing bit comes in, is that it's really about conversations and communication with people. But I wonder if you could elaborate on that, people matter, objects don't, and what that means, and just being a people first organization, how you sort of navigate the seas of marketing.
Yeah, I mean, it it shows up in a lot of ways, I think, at Kula Partners. For instance, I think as a primarily digital firm, and people who have been building for the web for a very long time, it's not uncommon for people to do that get to get a little bit of bright shiny object syndrome. It's about the thing that they create, and they can sometimes lose sight of the why. I think a lot of marketers are guilty of that. So on one hand, I mean, if people matter objects don't, it really does serve as a reminder to us as an organization to kind of keep ourselves in check there. But I see it come through so often elsewhere in our culture and just in the way that people think. It's funny, like anybody that's ever worked with me has probably heard me say, be yourself, everyone else is already taken. And we really work hard to create an environment where people can just show up and be themselves, and in all that means. It's funny, I don't think we originally thought that people matter, objects don't would translate to that kind of a thing, but it really has. So that's been nice, to one of those little happy accidents that happen to you along the way in business.
Yeah. Well, so back to our niche conversation, I wanted to talk a little bit about that niching down. And you'll see now I'm going to beat it into the ground. It's going to be
That's
niche.
quite all right.
Niche. So, you mentioned that you had done some work in senior services, healthcare, things like that. And then you've moved into this. You also mentioned sort of being a more broad-based marketing firm early on, but now you've got a hyper focus on manufacturing. Do you mind talking a little bit about that process, sort of the movement from broad scope down to a very specific scope? I think this is a challenge that a lot of small businesses deal with, where they're trying to be too many things to too many people. Especially in the agency world, it's really common that we all kind of start that way. And then, it seems like the ones that survive are the ones that, continue on, end up narrowing down at one point or another. So I wondered if you talk a little bit about the insight of understanding you needed to focus, and then the process of actually doing so.
Yeah, I mean, it probably started a little bit by getting into inbound and becoming a HubSpot partner early on, because we were fairly, I don't know how big the partner community was at the time that we started, but it was not a particularly large partner community. So you could find yourself into new business deals that were not geographically close to you at all, because of that we had that focus at the time. And so I could say, oh, well, that's what we were thinking when we went into it. And maybe we were a little bit, but like, I'm not going to give myself too much credit. It's in one way just something that you kind of start to notice as well. You're like, wow, we have 2 clients in California, and we're this small little agency in Halifax, and we never dreamed about having clients in California before. So that's pretty cool. See, and then over time, as your local market develops and you grow in business and you learn the agency business more and more, you need to probably realize that our part of Canada itself is small, but the Atlantic Canada, where I'm from, Nova Scotia, is less than 1 million people in total, and the whole region is less than 2, or right around 2. So it's not a big spot, and there's not a ton of opportunity necessarily, particularly in private sector. An awful lot of the agency business in this part of the world is driven oddly by government clients, like tourism accounts and things like that. So as an agency, we got a bit of taste of being able to work with some bigger clients and those that we wanted from further away. And then over time, we really began to realize that we needed to even narrow our focus in more. And frankly, after a period of time being a HubSpot agency, it wasn't much of a differentiator anymore. After a while, practically everybody was a HubSpot agency, so it didn't much matter. So we started down that path a number of years ago, and if there are agencies listening, the agency consultant that I've worked with and have followed the most around this is David C. Baker. So if you don't know David C. Baker, you should. And he's not just an agency consultant. His latest book has been on the business of expertise more broadly. But he really did help guide us through some positioning considerations, and and I think like well, when you start down this path, you can narrow in a horizontal focus or a vertical focus without going too much into it. My read of the situation has always been, when you look at the pros and cons of horizontal versus vertical in the agency space, the pros are so much stronger for vertical than they are for horizontal. Like it almost reads like, if you can get vertical, go vertical, and if you can't, well then, the second prize is horizontal. So we went down the path of exploring a vertical focus, and looked at the base of those folks that we worked with, and had a lot of impact with their business, and enjoyed doing the work, and a lot of other considerations, and then decided to narrow in on manufacturing.
Well, that's an interesting thing that you brought up. So actually, this is David Baker's new book. So I actually just finished it, and I'm about to just reread it because it was so impactful for me. And I mean, every page has got highlighting marks all over it and everything, but I need to go back and reread it. I'm not sure I'm smart enough to get it all the first time, so I got to go through it again. But big fan of David Baker, and yeah, his stuff about sort of the vertical alignment versus sort of the T-shaped version is really insightful. There's a lot of other things they do too, and so actually I might lead into some of that. But I did want to ask, just coming off that little conversation, do you think, just maybe, looking back as somebody who's been in marketing for quite some time, I mean, do you think that there's something positive or necessary to sort of starting broad, like finding your legs? I'm exploring with this idea a little bit lately, because I think there's a lot of people who don't start because they're afraid to, or they don't know where to begin. And I'm starting to maybe realize, and maybe it's just as I'm getting older too, I'm starting to feel like you kind of can't find your place until you've been in it for a while. There's no amount of just sitting down and noodling and stuff. I mean, maybe if you have a very specific product or something, but generally speaking, if you're launching an agency and you're just trying to get your feet wet and you're starting as a young person and work is kind of catch as catch can, it seems to me that it almost might be necessary to kind of start broad before you focus.
Well, I mean, I don't know. It's because it's so going to be baked in with self-reference criteria, right? Like, I suppose had I started with a very narrow focus, but somewhere else, I'd probably be telling you, "Oh no, you can totally start narrow and then end up in some other place." So I don't know. It'd be interesting. I mean, part of it is you can't find out what you're really interested in until you've experienced a little bit more variety. I think the one thing that agency owners fall victim to is they try to get too much variety out of their work. Like, they get their jollies out of solving marketing problems across a variety of number of industries as a way of making them feel smart. I remember filling out a timesheet when I first started with the first agency that I started working for, and I was really exhausted early on at the end of the day, and I was like, well, I don't know why I'm so tired. And I started looking at the timesheet, and I'd worked on 13 different companies within 13 different industries that day.
Oh wow!
Oh wow!
And man, did I feel smart, right?
And tired.
Yeah, and so not to make this a full advertisement for David C. Baker, but what he would tell you
That's
is
right. Maybe
that,
we'll be able to get him after this.
yeah. What he would tell you is that agency owners try to get too much of their variety and spice of life from their work. They would probably be well served to lead more boring work lives that are more focused, and lead more interesting personal lives, and not work all the damn time. So I tend to agree with that.
Yeah, no, I think that's really smart. Well, and so maybe this is a practical thing, but you mentioned timesheets, and being that you're a David Baker guy, I assume maybe you are familiar with like the Blair Ends of the world and some of these other guys that he runs around with, as they talk about sort of, pricing or valuing your efforts or the outcomes of your efforts versus the by the hour sort of model. And I wonder if you've been able to sort of implement that in the Kula Partners vision, or in the way that you guys work, if you've been able to sort of take these processes. And even though it's a little bit specific, a pricing question, I do think that it's something important that in general, small businesses, a lot of people are sort of, victim of this by the hour billing or by the hour pricing of ourselves, whether we're working part-time for somebody or whether we're doing it on our own. And so I just wondered if, as a devotee of those guys, if you happen to know anything about that or have thoughts about it.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about it. I mean, that's probably, when you look at my role at the firm, that's what I do. I sell these days. And I, of course, provide strategic oversight and things of that sort. But so you're quite right. I'm a devotee of Blair as well. And we moved away from billing by the hour. We never did. When we first started the agency, we wanted to start an agency that never had to make the phone call, that we're all the way through the budget, but we're only halfway through the project. So we sold deliverables, basically. Lost plenty of money doing some of those and over investing in them and all those things. Learn the hard way. And then we evolved at one point where we started selling and pricing on a per point basis. And you've probably seen that in some of the agency space. They're kind of adopting a bit of an agile methodology approach and then charging by the story point or what have you. And other people have called the points different things. The notion at the time, so I'll be full disclosure here, that the thinking at the time was that you were, if you could sell people points rather than hours, then it kind of abstracts it a bit, and they're playing with casino chips, and maybe they end up playing more chips. That would be the model that a lot of people were talking about at the time. We didn't find that actually worked at all. Our clients were all smart enough to just do the math and say, okay, well, this thing is X number of story points, so therefore I applied the point rate to it, and I know how much it is, and on. So it's like, you really find you're just playing hide the weenie, so we have evolved over the years to simply price the deliverable. But how that is priced or valued is not consistent, and it's not based upon inputs or hours. We do manage our work in a fully agile way. Every piece of work, whether it's a complex dev job or a marketing initiative or a rebrand or what have you, every one of those jobs is broken down into user stories where we know who we're creating the thing for, what the definition of done is, and we've estimated the level of complexity or order of complexity via a story point model. And our teams in the agency have a regular cadence of what they're able to ship in terms of number of story points. Every sprint in, sprint out, and they're managed and held accountable accordingly. But those story points and that work, that unit of effort, if you will, is in some way, as best as possible, divorced from the pricing. And pricing is done in much the same way that Blair advocates in his book, Pricing Creativity, where you really unpack the value that you're working to create together and price according to it, and according to your basically the risk or relative certainty with which you'll hit that value or achieve that value. I can tell you that I heard about value pricing and Blair's win without pitching model, and I sat through, I don't know, 3 or 4 presentations, read a lot of read his win without pitching book, read Pricing Creativity, read a lot of articles, and in doing all of that, thinking I'm a pretty, thinking I'm a pretty smart guy. I think I've got it all now, and I still didn't understand it all. So all that to say, there's a lot to unpack in that methodology. I would really encourage agency owners to do that. Adopting this approach, if it hasn't made Kula Partners seven figures in the last 3 years, I'd be surprised.
Yeah, no, it's pretty impressive. And in fact, for a short time, or about 6 months, I had a business coach, a guy named Jonathan Stark, that is sort of in this circle of guys and does a lot of talking on this stuff. He's got a book called Hourly Billing is Nuts. And, it's the same kind of thing. And he also is a significant, major devotee of these guys. And the methodology is incredible. What it makes me think of, though, and I wanted to ask you this, both as it pertains to niching down and into committing to a pricing model like this that's a little outside of tradition, just if tradition is hourly based billing. Maybe this is just stuff kind of built into you, but I'm seeing with a lot of entrepreneurs that they're a little bit wishy-washy, or they have trouble committing to one thing or another for fear of damaging their business. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about just sort of you might call it bravery, or just the willingness to commit. And I guess what I'm trying to understand is how much of your ability to say, okay, yes, with certainty, this is the niche we should follow, or yes, with certainty, this is the pricing methodology that we should choose, versus, these guys that I see, and myself included to some degree, where in our agency, it's like, well, God, we have all these clients from all these different industries. If I just tell 9 out of 10 of them that we're not working with them anymore, like that's a bold move for somebody like that. And so I wonder if you just talk about sort of that bit, whether it's sort of built into you, or if there was something that you were able to uncover that made that kind of decision easy.
It's Ryan, it's kind of funny that you asked me that question today, because my considerably better half, Bessie, is working through some coaching with her business, and she received this kind of 80 questionnaire that ranks a number of things about your personality from her coach her coach had sent it to her. So she said, fill it out and see what your scores are. And one of the things that it measures is your desire for certainty. And mine was an incredibly low 15. Like other things on this, I scored like 120 like growth. So to give you a sense of the scale that's at play with this model. So it was just literally a couple minutes before getting on this call, I was chatting with her about that. And so I suppose part of it is I don't have a strong need for certainty. So that's clearly just a personality trait. But I only own half the firm, it should be noted. So there's at least one other person out there that has something to say about it. He probably has more of a requirement for certainty than I. But the one thing I would say is, because I think it's hard for me to know why is it that I'm able to do that. But one more, the way I would put it back to you is to say, I would encourage somebody to not be too worried about it. Like, for instance, when we started focusing on manufacturing and really declared our focus, not all of our clients were in manufacturing. And even today, we've maintained a few favorites that are not in manufacturing. And beyond that, we've turned down a number of opportunities that are not in manufacturing, but we've had a number of opportunities brought to us, and even people saying, I know that this isn't what you do, like this isn't where you're focused, but will you help us do this? Because they've heard of us somewhere else or what have you, which oddly puts you in a stronger position from a sales perspective, because then you say, well, yeah, it's right, it's not quite, doesn't really quite fit our niche, and then you price it astronomically then if you want. So then if you're going to go outside of your niche, at least you're doing it for excessive profit. So you'd have that option available to you. And it just surprised me how much, if you go to our website, we declare who we work for and we get pretty specific. And so part of that, when you're looking at it, you're like, wow, you're going to really turn away anybody that doesn't match this to a T. That has not been my experience. People will still call. So I guess you move forward with some courage into that new positioning, knowing that the market's going to try to pull you and push you anyway.
Yeah. No, I think that's helpful. I think there's so many people who are just sort of naturally risk averse, or they're maybe if they're just getting a business off the ground and sort of everything is hinging on the success of this thing, we get caught up over analyzing or maybe thinking a little too much about stuff. And so anyway, it's just one of these things I've been trying to explore with people, especially in the agency space. We're more on the design side than anything. But in our agency, those kinds of things, even though we're very confident in our set of skills, to try and branch out or to try and niche down or something, for whatever reason, that confidence starts to slip. And so even though we know we can do the job, it's still just this idea of now only doing it for one group of people has been a really difficult transition. And so in my maybe 2 or 3 years really of starting to get into the Blair Enns of the world and the David Bakers of the world, and trying to understand the way that they teach and the way that they advocate, not just for pricing, but managing a business and everything else, it's pretty dramatically different from the model that I grew up on, which was the working for agencies and billing by the hour and all this stuff. And so it's been a tough thing to shake out of. And myself, I'm not particularly drawn to taking big risks and things like that. So when I do make steps or make moves, generally speaking, things have to be pretty much in my wheelhouse for me to feel great about it. And which I guess is naturally niching me into subsect of things. But I aspire to get out of those boxes a little bit and try and make some bold decisions along the way. But at the same time, it's I don't want to put our income at risk or something.
It's interesting, a bit of the now, Ryan, we're just going to get into like a full-on consulting session. But I guess where I was going with that is that when you said that, it kind of seemed to me like it was coming from a point of, or a viewpoint of, if I focus, what am I turning my back on? But I would also say, what is the lack of focus keeping you from? And it's keeping you from getting to deeper, harder to crack problems. What you find once you narrow in on a specific vertical, as an example, or kind of niche down, is that the more time you spend in it, you begin to uncover new nuances and challenges that you didn't see when you were just kind of flying by from one industry to another. So there's an invitation, if you will, into depth in the work that comes with focus that maybe isn't as apparent. I think when you start, you really do feel like you're more giving away than you are getting. But I think there's a real gift in it, because no longer then do you have to think about what you're going to write about, or what you're if you were going to sit down and write a blog post or do a piece of content, like it's not as scattered anymore, and that focus and depth brings a new level of understanding, and it helps you, I think, be able to help clients in deeper ways, which helps drive the pricing premium and things of that sort that, of course, we all seek.
I guess, and even just hearing you articulate that, it does make total sense, because, I guess, it's like the quick Google search, right? We can all be an expert on anything now in a matter of 10 keywords or something. And we can all have sort of this superficial understanding of an industry or whatever. But that's what is required to do minimal, low-paying work for a big industry. If you're, for example, going to niche into something like manufacturing, you must develop expertise in their field. You have to tell them things they don't know. And so it does require a little additional depth. It's reading the book on it instead of just reading the tweet.
Yeah, and of course, as more and more of your clients fit that that profile that you've set, whatever you've decided to focus on, you'll see the patterns that just weren't visible before. And then once those patterns present themselves, then you start to find yourself into conversations when the prospect on the other end of the line says, "Do you have a camera in your office? Do you actually have you been listening into the last conversation I just had with my team?" Or things like that. It's kind of, and David and others will point to that as when that starts to happen, is probably a pretty good sign.
Yeah, that's what we do. That's how I knew you were taking that survey earlier. We just plugged in a camera a little bit ago to prep.
Exactly right.
All right. Well, let's let's start talking a little bit, maybe some practical stuff. I mean, I think, this has actually been a really great conversation. I'm grateful for the direction it went, even though it's way off our notes. And
Quite all right. Quite all right.
So anyway, but maybe we can start turning back towards the industry a little bit and just thinking about the kind of work that you guys are doing. With this breadth of experience, how are people doing, and maybe you can speak in sort of general terms, given we don't have largely a audience built on your type of client. But if you were, trying to talk about the types of services that you guys are delivering on behalf of people now, like what are you seeing trending and what's popular in the space?
Well, look, on the web design and development side of our business, it's been our strength for a while is when the going gets complex, tough integrations, etc. That's often when our phone rings. And in this day and age, we've seen a huge surge of interest in e-commerce generally, and just frankly, even just more complex e-commerce deployments, et cetera. It's surprising to me how much COVID has really driven that, because of course, unless you're starting a e-com site for your cafe or something on Shopify, the chances are, if you're doing something complex, it's going to be 6, 8, 12 months to spin that up, not 6-8 minutes. But it surprises me still how some people's response to COVID was a massive, big e-commerce engagements. But I would say what we see more broadly than just in this time of COVID is a real turn towards account-based marketing and taking account-based approaches. That's something that in maybe the SaaS space, B2B SaaS, they've been at that a little bit longer, but manufacturers are pretty, for the most part, pretty new to it. ABM doesn't have a huge penetration within the manufacturing space yet, but there's an awful lot of interest there, and it is accelerated somewhat because of COVID as well, because of course trade shows and events, which can make up 70-80% of a manufacturing marketer's budget, they're just not happening. And then the question is, well, everybody that we sell to every year was going to show up at this one event, and now that isn't happening. How do I get in front of those target accounts? And of course, account-based approaches tend to like the way to that.
Well, yeah, and do you mind maybe just breaking that down a little bit more, giving sort of a definition of what this account-based marketing is, just in general terms?
Yeah, so I like to try to completely unabstract it. So account-based marketing is simply aligning your marketing and sales investments around a set of target accounts. Now, you can get much more complex than that, but let's just take a very low-tech example. If you were trying to sell your agency services to Nike, and Nike's headquarters had a billboard outside of the headquarters, and you took out a billboard and had creative for your agency advertising to Nike outside of that headquarters, well, that's an account-based advertising tactic. It's account-based marketing. But in this day and age, of course, we can do a lot of that digitally. So platforms enable us to identify and serve ads to only our target accounts, only certain titles or levels of seniority within those accounts, things of that sort, and allows you to really deploy an integrated marketing and sales motion, if you will, that's meant to bring that target account in from basically not knowing who you are into the pipeline and nurtured into a real quality lead. Of course, ABM always starts with the end in mind. I mean, when you start with a target account list, everybody you're talking to at the start is MQL and is an SQL. So it's a completely different dynamic than what people have typically been used to as, I think, a funnel thinking driving a kind of more inbound approach.
Okay. As a guy with background in sales, and I assume things have evolved a little bit, how much in this account-based marketing do you find or I guess what value would you assign to sort of the fundamentals versus these shiny new things? You mentioned earlier, and we've got it in the notes too, chasing down these shiny things like chat bots and the latest tech, whatever they've got out there. But how much of it is still fundamental relationship development versus great new technology?
Well, man, the technology does power quite a change in what you're able to do. Again, when you're able to serve, when I can reliably serve an ad on a one-to-one basis to an organization, that changes the game. When I can monitor a set of target accounts and see when they're spiking on intent for the various lines of business that I offer, and then serve them up ads that align with that intent, that changes the game. When I can take that intent spike data and automate that, forwarding it over to my sales organization and to the sales guy or girl that's assigned that target account to engage in more direct sales outreach. And I can also, that's based upon that intent trigger. And then I'm also serving the halo ad to give them a bit of air cover in over top of that. That changes the game. So I think in the world of ABM, yeah, relationship matter and people matter, yes, in the sales process. But I mean, ABM starts from a point of not knowing the actual person that we want to speak to. All we know is the real business that we want to sell to. And the technology helps us get there.
Can you talk about the differences between B2B versus B2C and how they would apply? And you're focusing in manufacturing, but I'm sure a lot of the principles of sales are similar versus compared to B2B versus B2C.
Yeah, well, in so many cases in a B2C scenario, the market is, I mean, it's not unlimited, but it's fundamentally unlimited. Like, so, there's, we mentioned Nike before. So, well, there's, anybody can, most anybody is in their target audience, so they can buy a pair of shoes, right? But if one of our clients, they manufacture fire suppression systems for buildings, sprinkler systems, things of that sort. Well, there's only so many people that can buy that. You have to buy in commercial building. Or another perhaps even more targeted example, I work with a flexible packaging manufacturer who primarily services the frozen food and pet food market. So you have to be a manufacturer of frozen food or a manufacturer of pet food in order to be one of their prospects. Well, now all of a sudden, I mean, talk about a difference from B2C. They don't need to be a household name. They don't need to be like the Kleenex. they need to be known amongst the 500 people that can actually buy from them. And those sales cycles are 18 to 24 months, maybe 36 months long, as opposed to a consumer sales cycle, which is, I see this on the shelf and I decide to buy it the next minute. So where ABM really fits is in those B2B scenarios where there is a relatively small total addressable market, and you're trying to really be able to wrap your arms around those people that you need that need to know who you are versus just general mass awareness. I mean, that would be the biggest difference with the B2C scenario.
Yeah, that makes sense. When you're dealing with a B2B client, how important is it for your designers to have contact with your salespeople and work together? And how does that process work? It's got to be, I'm sure that everyone has to be on the same page to get the client's needs done, because the designers are just usually creating, ad A, and the salespeople are in the thick of it, dealing directly with the consumer and your client. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, you certainly, I think getting sales input and insight early on in the process is really helpful in terms of when you build out an account-based approach to really align the messaging with your various segments. Because you're quite right. I mean, sometimes marketing is only dealing with it in theory, and it's the salespeople that are living it day to day, and they kind of feel a little bit more. We find early on in the process in our work with clients, that we try to get exposure to the sales organization, try to get conversations with the sales team, begin to understand what they have found actually works and resonates with prospects. At the same time, this may sound unkind to salespeople, and I don't mean it to, but um, I I do listen to them, but I try not to take their word as gospel, because I find that they are, especially in the manufacturing space, salespeople are oftentimes more used to dealing with customers than they are with prospects. They're better farmers than they are hunters, and they're not always the most forward thinking in terms of um, coming up with new ways to connect with prospects. They stick with what's worked in the past. So, but I do think that that getting that sales intel early on is invaluable in kind of informing your gut and your opinion. And our creative director has no shortage of appetite for that. I found, interestingly, the best creatives I've worked with are the ones that don't mind getting close to the sale. They don't mind talking about the money. They don't mind seeing the dirtiness of the decision. The creatives out there that just think they make really cool TV ads and then they can go and call it a day without talking to anybody. Those are the ones that I find that tend to be less effective.
Do you think it's important for creatives to have some sales experience? Would you ever recommend them just doing a sales job for a little while just to get that experience behind their belt?
I don't know. I wouldn't say it's required. I think because sales is a hard game, and not everybody's good at it. And we all sell ourselves in different ways without having been in sales. I mean, if you've ever been a young guy or girl in your late teens, early 20s, going out to a bar, if that's not sales, I don't know what it is. So, we all can have kind of personal experiences where we were trying to persuade. And I think that can inform a designer's perspective without them having to actually be a salesperson.
Yeah, no, it's true. As a guy who works on the creative side, my personality has never been sort of drawn to the sales process. But I think what you're trying to say, or at least the way it's coming across to me, is that the creatives who seem to be the most effective are those who at least have some understanding of the business aspect of this thing. So they're willing to talk about money. They're willing to do all those things because, like it or not, it's part of the process. Now, maybe in my case, I'm not an assertive salesperson, but I have no problem talking about the money or the business aspect of the job.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. Interesting, though, actually, as we always think about sales as being very assertive and hard closing, eh? Like we always think of somebody that's in sales as that they put the squeeze on people and they almost make them do stuff they wouldn't otherwise want to do. But of course, I think when we see people that are actually really good at sales, they don't do that at all. They have conversations and they find out mutually beneficial ways to help, and they have a way of making sure the financial consideration is such that it's profitable at the end of the day. So anyway.
Yeah,
just in defense of salespeople.
No, I think it is a good point. And I mean, I spent a lot of years doing marketing and advertising for car dealers. So this was something we had to deal with a lot. Obviously they've got the reputation of the plaid sports coat and the, slick back hair and all that to overcome. And so I'm very familiar with the difference in the sales process. And especially now, I mean, people are much slicker. There's a lot more focus, and just to sort of circle back to the beginning of our conversation about being people first. I think there are a lot more people who are honestly looking for ways to help. Now, if they help you by selling you this product, fine, that's a mitzvah. But if not, it's generally speaking, more mutually beneficial now maybe than it's been.
Yeah, I think the world of social selling and whatnot has made that a little bit more likely to be the case, I think. Probably. Yeah.
So one thing I just wanted to tip on, I mean, we're starting to get to the end of this thing, but I wanted to talk a little bit about just sort of internal processes as you're building your company. You mentioned Agile as a tool that you guys use. And we've had, just by happenstance in the past few episodes that we've done, we've had people talk about different methodologies and things for running their businesses. It's just come up in conversation. And Agile is one of those that I don't think we've really explored, but we kind of throw it out there like everyone knows what it is. And I wondered if you wouldn't just talk a little bit about the Agile process and how it helps you serve your clients better.
Yeah, I really feel like my director of operations should now be on the podcast because he's, this is what he does. I will say this. So what the Agile process does for clients kind of, I guess, very directly is they know exactly what's being worked on at any given time. They know what the definition of done is as well, and there's a regularly scheduled time when you're going to be demoing what's been done in front of that client on an every 2-week basis. So there's I think that transparency for a lot of clients is helpful. I think the benefit that they get that they maybe don't think of originally is that they get stuff delivered, not stuff talked about. When you're organizing in an agile fashion appropriately, I mean, at the end of a sprint, it's either done, so the ticket's either closed or it isn't. The thing's either delivered or it's not. It's either done or it's not. There's no 80% done, 60% done. There's no half credits. None of that. So it forces us as an agency and has made us as an agency over time very good at hitting deadlines and knowing what we can deliver when. So that means on the client side, you get basically tighter delivery and more on-time delivery. Maybe the negative to that for clients is it also means that the team is acutely aware of when they need client impact or input and how long clients have to give it. So any client delays are probably amplified in the Agile scenario because it can.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great point. I mean, there are so many people, especially in sort of older traditional ways of running ad agencies and things like that, where you've got these retainers and projects kind of go on without an end. And so I think it's one of the things that's actually very interesting about these sprint processes and some of these other things where people are again, focusing more on the deliverable rather than all this theory. And so we're just trying to get stuff done. And I think that's great. And getting a client to come back with, on a schedule that works for your availability to deliver also makes for a better experience for the people who work within your agency, because it's hard to do projects that fizzle out or go on for 6 months with no apparent end and things like that. It's hard to get excited about that stuff.
Yeah, I agree with that. There's some other benefits as well. I mean, I think from a talent management perspective, I really like what Agile allows us to do. I mean, if you think about it in the traditional kind of hourly model of an agency land, well, the junior person gets billed out at a lesser rate, right? So we just cut their hourly rate down versus what somebody else in the agency would do. And then they're typically expected to work way more crazy hours than everybody else, even though they're billing the least. And then whether or not what they're doing is good or not is in some ways just being judged after the fact, right? And of course, that side of it does need to happen. I mean, people still need oversight as they're starting their agency career and things of that sort. But one thing it allows us to do is the number of points that a new person to the firm is expected to ship is quite a bit different than the number of points that somebody who's been there for a long time is expected to ship. So we don't throttle the hours of their billable rates or their relative worth within the team or necessarily. We just recognize there's a level of complexity and output that you can get to now, but then there's a real nice mechanism for ramping that up over time as they get better. You just simply up those ship targets. Well, if you think about that from without the objective nature that happens with by tracking everything by the story point, right? Without getting to that common denominator, it'd be pretty hard to do what I just said. All you know then is, oh, well, we gave Joe one extra thing last week than we used to give him. But it's like, well, was it more or less complex than the previous things that he or she was working on, et cetera? So I feel that the Agile process has helped us in terms of talent management. I've also mentioned how it helps us with clients. But lastly, in this time of COVID, I mean, it's fully online. We work with a Jira Atlassian suite. Our team is very used to pre-COVID getting everything that they need is there. So therefore, when we had to shift to working remotely in early March here in Canada, that was a seamless transition for us. We're still working remotely today, and it's our intent presently not to reopen the office in a meaningful way within 2020. So, that we were able to do that without skipping a beat, and we know exactly how much we're shipping now versus what we were shipping in February before all that happened. So we can quantitatively and objectively know how we're performing now as an organization versus how we were performing then, and is the remote work scenario hurting or helping us? A lot of organizations in this time can't say that. They can't say for certainty that, things are working pretty well. We're still shipping at the same rate. We're still producing at the same rate in April than we were in February. And for most organizations, that level of performance management is a lot more qualitative and seat of the pants, I find.
Yeah, well, and I think that makes a great point too, just about process in general. I think, so many small businesses struggle with things like that, the ability to processize their work or understand their workflows, things like this. And, or maybe just don't pay any attention at all to that stuff. And this ability to have this oversight because of the nature of this process, I think is a really great, if nothing else, it's an illustrative model of why you should have some kind of process in place.
And your listeners really ought to know that I am not naturally predisposed to this in any way, shape, or form. Like, there's nothing about Carman that's process driven. And if you had to wait for me to create this kind of process and to implement the systems, we'd probably still be waiting. So as an agency owner, I recognize I have a bit more of a inclination to fly by the seat of the pants than most. And I think it's important to recognize when that's the case, and then delegate accordingly and get it over to somebody else who actually can get that over the line. So even though I can speak passionately about the benefits of it, I also recognize that I would have been the worst guy to actually implement.
I think
that's okay. I can relate.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that is pretty common in the creative field. Most people aren't predisposition to go that route. Well,
they can work without the structure, and then they almost expect those that work with them can work without the structure too, and that's the part where they get it wrong.
You're working with a team versus just yourself. Yeah. Well, we're almost to that time, Carman. Can you tell people where they can find you and how they can reach out if they want to get in contact with you?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, come on over to kulapartners.com, KULA partners.com, and you can find us all there. And we wouldn't be a digital agency worth our salt if the website wasn't decent enough to guide you on your journey from that point. So let's start there rather than give you a bunch of Twitter handles and whatnot too.
That's great. Well, and we'll make sure to put all that stuff in the show notes too. So thank you, Carman, so much for coming on. It's a great conversation. I mean, like I said, we went way off script, but I'm really grateful for the talk we had. I think there's a lot of good stuff in there.
I enjoy not having a script, gentlemen. This has been fun. Good to chat with you.
Great.
Likewise.
Well, thank you to everybody who tuned in this week and every week, and we'll see you next time.